So if I'm being honest with myself, when I imagine the universe, so first thing I imagine about our world is that we humans, and me certainly as one particular human, know very. My first assumption is I know almost nothing about how anything works. So first of all, that actually applies for things that humans do know, like quantum mechanics and all the things that there's different expertises that I just have not dedicated to. So even that starting point. But if we take all of knowledge as human civilization, we know almost nothing. That's kind of an assumption I have, because it seems like we keep discovering mysteries, and it seems like human history is defined by moments when we said, okay, we pretty much figured it all out. And then you realize a century later, when you said that, you didn't figure out anything. Okay, so that's like a starting point. The second thing I have is I feel like the entirety of the universe is just filled with alien civilizations. Statistically, there's the important thing that enables that belief for me is that they don't have to be human-like. They can be anything. And it's just the fact that life exists and just seeing the way life is on Earth, that it just finds a way. It finds a way in so many different complicated environments. It finds a way. Whatever that force is, that same force has to find a way elsewhere also. But then if I'm also being honest, and I don't know how many hours in a day I spend seriously considering the possibility that we're alone. I don't know when my heart is and mind are filled with wonder, I think about all the different life that's out there. But to really imagine that we're alone, like really imagine all the vastness that's out there, we're alone, not even bacteria.
I would say you don't have to believe that we are alone, but you have to admit it's a possibility of our ignorance of the universe so far. You can have a belief about something in the absence of evidence. Carl Sagan famously described that as the definition of faith. If you believe something when there's no evidence, you have faith that there's life in the universe, but you can't demonstrate, you can't prove it mathematically, you can't show me evidence of that.
But is there so mathematically, math is a funny thing. Is there, the way physicists think, like intuition, so basic reasoning, is there some value to that?
Well, I'd say you can certainly make a very good argument. I think you've kind of already made one. Just the vastness of the universe is the default argument people often turn to, that surely there should be others out there. It's hard to imagine. There are of order of 10 to the 22 stars in our observable universe. And so really the question comes down to, what is the probability of one of those 10 to the 22 planets, let's say, Earth-like planets, if they all have Earth-like planets, going on to form life spontaneously? That's the process of abiogenesis, the spontaneous emergence of life.
Also, the word spontaneous is a funny word.
Okay, maybe we won't use spontaneous, but not being, let's say, seeded by, say, some other civilization or something like this. Like it naturally emerges.
Because even the word spontaneous makes it seem less likely.
Yeah.
Like there's just this chemistry and an extremely random process.
Right. It could be a very gradual process over millions of years of growing complexity in chemical networks.
Maybe there's a force in the universe that pushes it towards interesting complexity, pockets of complexity, that ultimately creates something like life, which we can't possibly define yet. And sometimes it manifests itself into something that looks like humans, but it could be a totally different kind of computational information processing system that we're too dumb to even visualize.
Yeah, certainly, it's kind of weird that complexity develops at all, right? Because it seems like the opposite to our physical intuition, if you're training in physics, of entropy, that things should, complexity is hard to spontaneously, or I shouldn't say spontaneously, but hard to emerge in general. Yes. And so that's an interesting problem. I think there's been, certainly from an evolutionary perspective, you do see growing complexity. And there's a nice argument, I think it's by Gould, who shows that if you have a certain amount of complexity, it can either become less complex or more complex through random mutation. And the less complex things are stripping away something that was necessary potentially to their survival. And so in general, that's going to be not particularly useful in its survival. And so it's going to be detrimental to strip away a significant amount of its useful traits. Whereas if you add something, the most typical thing that you add is probably not useful at all. It's probably just it doesn't really affect its survival negatively, but neither does it provide any significant benefit. But sometimes on rare occasions, of course, it will be of benefit. And so if you have a certain level of complexity, it's hard to go back in complexity, but it's fairly easy to go forward with enough bites at the cherry. You will eventually build up in complexity, and that tends to be why we see complexity grow in certainly in an evolutionary sense, but also perhaps it's operating in chemical networks that led to the emergence of life. I guess the real problem I have with the numbers game, just to come back to that, is that we are talking about a certain probability of that occurring. It may be to go from the primordial soup, however you want to call it, the ingredients that the earth started with, the organic molecules, the probability of going from that initial condition to something that was capable of Darwinian natural selection that maybe we could define as life. The probability of that is maybe 1% of the time that happens, in which case you're right, the universe will be absolutely teeming with life, but it could also be 10 to the power minus 10, in which case it's 1 per galaxy, or 10 to the power of minus 100, in which case the vast majority of universes even do not have life within it.
Or 90%.
Or 90.
You said 1%. You said 1%, but it could be 90% if the conditions, the chemical conditions of a planet are correct, or a moon are correct.
I admit that. It could be any of those numbers. And the challenge is we just have no rigorous reason to expect why 90% is any, because we're talking about a probability of a probability. Is 90% more a priori likely than 10 to the power minus 20?
Well, the thing is, we do have an observation, N of 1, of Earth. And it's difficult to know what to do with that, what kind of intuition you build on top of that, because on Earth, it seems like life finds a way.
Okay.
In all kinds of conditions, in all kinds of crazy conditions.
Good.
And it's able to like build up from the basic chemistry. You could say, okay, maybe it takes a little bit of time to develop some complicated technology like mitochondria. I don't know, like photosynthesis. Fine, but it seems to figure it out, and like do it extremely well.
Yeah, but I would say you're describing a different process. I mean, maybe I'm at fault for separating these two processes, but to me, you're describing basically natural selection, evolution at that point. Whereas I'm really describing abiogenesis, which is to me a separate, distinct process.
To you, limited to human scientists, yes, but why would it be a separate process? Why is the birth of life a separate process from the process of life? Why is I mean, we're uncomfortable with we're uncomfortable with the Big Bang. We're uncomfortable with the first thing, I think. Like, where did this come from?
Right. So I think I would say, I just twist that question around and say, you're saying, why is it a different process? Why? And I would say, why shouldn't it be a different process? Which isn't really a good defense, except to say that we have knowledge of how natural selection evolution works. We think we understand that process. We have almost no information about the earliest stages of how life emerged on our planet. It may be that you're right, and it is a part of a continuum. It may be that it is also a distinct, improbable set of circumstances that led to the emergence of life. As a scientist, I'm just trying to be open-minded to both possibilities. If I assert that life must be everywhere, to me, you run the risk of experimenter's bias. If you think you know what the answer is, if you look at an Earth-like planet and you are preconditioned to think there's a 90% chance of life on this planet, it's going to, at some level, affect your interpretation of that data. Whereas if however critical you might be of the agnosticism that I impose upon myself, remain open to both possibilities, then I trust in myself to make a fair assessment as to the reality of that evidence for life.
Yeah, but I wonder sort of scientifically, and that's really beautiful to hear and inspiring to hear. I wonder scientifically how many firsts we truly know of, like, and then we don't eventually explain as actually a step number 1 million in a long process. So I think that's a really interesting thing if there's truly first in this universe. Like, for us, whatever happened at the Big Bang is a kind of first, the origin of stuff. But it just, again, it seems like history shows that we'll figure out that it's actually a continuation of something. But then physicists say that time is emergent, and that our causality in time is a very human kind of construct. That it's very possible that all of this, so there could be really firsts of a thing to which we attach a name. So whatever we call life, maybe there is an origin of it.
Yeah, and I would also say I'm open to the idea of it being part of a continuation, but the continuation maybe is more broader, and it's a continuation of chemical systems and chemical networks. And what we call this one particular type of chemistry and this behavior of chemistry life. But it is just one manifestation of all the trillions of possible permutations in which chemical reactions can occur. And we assert specialness to it because that's what we are. And so it's also true of intelligence. You could extend the same thing and say, we're looking for intelligent life in the universe, and then you sort of, where do you define intelligence? Where's that continuum of something that's really like us? Are we alone? There may be a continuum of chemical systems, a continuum of intelligences out there, and we have to be careful of our own arrogance of assuming specialness about what we are, that we are some distinct category of phenomena, whereas the universe doesn't really care about what category we are. It's just doing what it's doing and doing everything in infinite diversity and infinite combinations, essentially what it's doing. And so we are taking this one slice and saying, no, this has to be treated separately. And I'm open to the idea that it could be a truly separate phenomenon, but it may just be like a snowflake. Every snowflake's different. It may just be that this one particular iteration is another variant of the vast continuum.
Yeah, maybe the algorithm of natural selection itself is an invention of Earth. I kind of also tend to suspect that this whatever the algorithm is, it kind of operates at all levels throughout the universe. Mm-hmm. But maybe this is a very kind of peculiar thing that where there's a bunch of chemical systems that compete against each other somehow for survival under limited resources. And that's a very Earth-like thing. Mm-hmm. We have a nice balance of there's a large number of resources, enough to have a bunch of different kinds of systems competing, but not so many that they get lazy.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why bacteria were very lazy for a long time. Maybe they didn't have much competition.
Quite possibly. I mean, I tried to, as fun as it is to get into the speculation about the definitions of life and what life does and this gross network of possibilities. Honestly, for me, the strongest argument for remaining agnostic is to avoid that bias in assessing data. And we've seen it. I mean, Percival Lowell, I talked about on my channel, and maybe last year or 2 years ago. He's a very famous astronomer who, in the 19th century, was claiming the evidence of canals on Mars. And from his perspective, and even at the time, culturally, it was widely accepted that Mars would, of course, have life. I mean, I think it seems silly to us, but it was kind of similar arguments to what we're using now about exoplanets, that, well, of course, there must be life in the universe. How could it just be here? And so it seemed obvious to people that when you looked at Mars with its polar caps, even if, its atmosphere had seasons, it seemed obvious to them that too would be a place where life not only was present, but had emerged to a civilization which actually was fairly comparable in technology to our own, because it was building canal systems. Of course, a canal system seems a bizarre techno-signature to us, but it was a product of their time. To them, that was the cutting edge in technology. It should be a warning shot, actually, a little bit for us, that if we think, solar panels or building Starlinks or whatever, space mining is like an inevitable techno-signature, that may be laughably antiquated compared to what other civilizations far more advanced than us may be doing. And so anyway, Percival Lowell, he I think was a product of his time, that he thought life was there inevitably. He even wrote about it extensively. And so when he saw these lines, these lineae on the surface of Mars, to him it was just obvious they were canals. And that was experimentalist bias playing out. He was told, for one, that he had basically the greatest eyesight out of any of his peers. An ophthalmologist had told him that in Boston, that his eyesight was, absolutely spectacular. So he just was convinced everything he saw was real. And secondly, he was convinced there was life there. And so to him, it just added up. And then that kind of wasted, decades of research of treating the idea of Mars being inhabited by this canal civilization. But on the other hand, it's maybe not a waste, because it is a lesson in history of how we should be always on guard against our own preconceptions and biases about whether life is out there, and furthermore, what types of things life might do if it is there.
If I were running this simulation, which we'll also talk about because you make the case against it, but if I were running a simulation, I would definitely put you in a room with an alien, and just to see you mentally freak out for hours at a time. You for sure would have thought, you will be convinced that you've lost your mind. I mean, no, not that, but I mean, like, if we discover life, we discovered interesting new physical phenomena, I think the right approach is definitely to be extremely skeptical and be very, very careful about things you want to be true. That's really
I would say
admirable.
I'm not like some extreme denialist of evidence. If there was compelling evidence for life on another planet, I would be the first one to be celebrating that and be shaking hands with the alien on the White House lawn, whatever. That would be, I grew up with Star Trek, and that was my fantasy, was to, be Captain Kirk and fly across the stars, meeting other civilizations. So there's nothing more I'd want to be true, as I've said. But we just have to guard against it when we're assessing data. But I have to say, I'm very skeptical that we will ever have that Star Trek moment. Even if there are other civilizations out there, they're never going to be at a point which is in technological lockstep with us, similar level of development, even intellectually. The idea that they could have a conversation with us, even through a translator. I mean, we can't communicate with humpback whales. We can't communicate with dolphins in a meaningful way. We can sort of bark orders at them, but we can't have abstract conversations with them about things. And so the idea that we will ever have that fulfilling conversation, I'm deeply skeptical of. And I think a lot of us are drawn to that. It is maybe a replacement for God to some degree, that father figure civilization that might step in, teach us the error of our ways, and bestow wisdom upon our civilization. But they could equally be a giant fungus that doesn't even understand the idea of socialization, because it's the only entity on its planet. It just swells over the entire surface, and it's incredibly intelligent, because maybe each node communicates with each other to create essentially a giant neural net. But it has no sense of what communication even is. And so alien life that's out there is surely going to be extremely diverse. I'm pretty skeptical that we'll ever get that fantasy moment I always had as a kid of having a dialogue with another civilization.